everybody. Hi. How are y'all? A lot of new faces, so if you haven't been here before, thank you all for coming. We're the Cedars Union. We are a nonprofit art incubator, and we offer facilities, pro bono services, and programming to artists. Afterwards, if you want to go on a tour, I'll talk about that at the end of it, but I'm going to actually let Erin go ahead and introduce herself and hand it over to her. So thank you, Erin.
My name is Erin Cluley, as I think most of you probably know, and I have Erin Cluley Gallery. I've been in business for 11 years. There's an image of the gallery there. It's the last day of Zeke Williams' show at the gallery, so go check it out later this afternoon if you can. I have kind of like a few buckets of things I was going to talk about, and then we'll have some questions at the end, but I was going to talk a little bit about my journey just to kind of give some context about where I'm coming from. And, you know, as we all know, our journey in this industry is not, you know, direct A to B. It can be very zigzaggy. I'll talk about doing the work. I'll talk about community. I'll talk about kind of post-grad work, if that applies to you, and kind of thinking about yourself as a business, relationships with galleries and curators, and then questions at the end. So my journey was that I studied painting at Midwestern State University, small state school. It was a small program, but with some pretty, I would say, like really great professors, kind of fiery, pushed us really hard. You know, everything from, you know, the foundations and things that you learn in your foundations courses in university, but also they really focused on kind of the pragmatic stuff, like I knew how to frame all of my work when I left there and build my own stretchers and all those things. And, you know, later I realized not every program gets into all of that, but I was able to use that to my advantage later. So I studied painting at Midwestern State. My professor, Liz Yaros, professor of painting there, was really, you know, encouraging me to get my master's, but I wasn't really ready for that right after school. So I got a job at the newspaper, the local newspaper, and I did graphic design for like 2 years. And it was like, you know, everything from like these huge car ads to things that were more fun. But what it did do is it really like, you know, threw me to the wolves in terms of learning all of the graphic design things that later on I was able to do a lot of my own things whenever I opened the gallery. Can everybody hear me? I mean, in the back, kind of? I need to speak up? Okay. So I worked for the newspaper and for a couple of years, and then I did decide that grad school, it was, you know, I was going to apply for graduate school, so for painting. And so I applied to a bunch of different schools. I got into one school, and it was the Maryland Institute College of Art, which was an incredible program. It was kind of my number 2 choice behind RISD, which I'm not even really sure why, but anyway, it ended up being the perfect place for me. And it was a 2-year program, and you know, I learned so much then just kind of about what a studio practice really is, you know, having all of these, you know, colleagues around me. There was a small program, there was 14 of us. I was studying under Grace Hardigan, so she was like old school, kind of second generation abstract expressionist, so she was like living art history. But, you know, the thing that was new to me was, you know, going to galleries. I mean, I was in Wichita Falls at Midwestern State before that. I don't know if there is a gallery there. We would go to Dallas at times, but you know, so just like I had flipped through Art News and Art Forum all those years prior. So, you know, really going into the galleries, we would go up to New York a lot, you know, galleries in Baltimore, of course. But it was a 2-year program. I feel like it just exposed me to the art world in a way that I had not been. And I was thinking that I would teach, but I did a couple of teaching assistantships and realized that there are more gifted teachers in the world. And I also think I was young. I was like close to these, I was 23 and the people were 18 and I don't know. So it was just, and honestly, they were coming into the MICA undergrad program and these, I say kids, they were, whatever, young people were incredibly talented. So I was like, what the fuck do I have to teach these people? You know what I mean? So anyway, but I loved being on the university campus and things. So I thought maybe I'd get some sort of administrative role in admissions because I worked in admissions whenever I was at Midwestern State. So grad school is starting to come to an end, and the job at Grimaldis Gallery, which was where Grace Hardigan, my director, was represented, the kind of gallery manager role had opened up. So I applied for that job. I told Grace, please put in a good word. And so I got that job. And so I worked for Grimaldis for 4 years. And it's really where I, cut my teeth. Like, he had been in business already for, I think, 30 years at that time. And, he had worked with everyone from, Grace, but had shown people like, he had shown de Kooning kind of in the later years. He showed Alice Neal, but he was also, always looking and showing the most contemporary things. But he, at the time was kind of willing to relinquish some control and said, sure, you look and talk with artists, and so I was able to kind of build the program in a way, or start to reshape it. And he trusted me with that, and I loved it. And I also loved working with the clients. It came very easy to me, and I'd never worked a day of retail in my life, but it didn't feel like retail to me, although it is. It just felt like I was telling the story of the artists, and I loved that part of it. So I loved kind of the sales part of it. So I worked with him for 4 years. My sister back here, she and her wife, they're pregnant with twins, and I was like, I think I want to get back closer to family. I had been up there for about 6 years. But I also thought from Baltimore, it was like, I could go to New York from here. That would be like, I'm never going to be sort of that close, or I'll go back to Texas. So I applied for jobs in New York, which, as you would imagine, it was incredibly competitive, and I wasn't living there. I got one interview. I don't even know how many things I applied for. So I decided to come back to Texas. So I came back to Texas really not knowing where I would land. And so I sort of floated around. I was thinking Austin, Houston, and I have to say, I did not know what Dallas was like in terms of, even though it was kind of the big city closest to me growing up, 2 hours away, I had no idea what the cultural landscape was like here. And really, for a gallery and for what I hope for working artists, it's a good foundation with the institutions we have and the collectors and the galleries and the places like this, which I'll get into a little bit more. So I moved back here to Texas, ended up getting the job at Dallas Contemporary, which I worked for 5 years there. So it felt like a good transition from what I was doing in the gallery, which was kind of wearing a lot of hats. And so then I'm going to Dallas Contemporary, and of course wearing probably double the amount of hats. But anyway, it was fun. It was like kind of the operations side of exhibitions, but I was also, I was new to Dallas. I didn't really know anyone. I was really eager to get to know people. So that then put me into the kind of like, hey, will you go to this dinner with these people, as kind of a membership development thing at Dallas Contemporary? I'm like, yeah, sure. So I was saying yes to everything. So I worked there for 5 years, and towards the end of that tenure, I met my now husband. So some personal kind of things started to happen where I thought, oh, okay, maybe I will stay in Dallas. I had worked with Butch McGregor quite a bit on projects with Dallas Contemporary. And so a few different things aligned, and I decided to approach Butch about opening a space over in West Dallas, like in the Trinity Groves area. Well, he was thrilled with the idea. I created a business plan. Again, I'll kind of talk a little bit more about that. It was the best thing I did. He wanted it. It also just helped me to, know my place in all of this. And so opened in West Dallas 11 years ago this month. And, now I'm, doing the things that I love doing, which is nurturing these careers of these artists, placing work, what I hope in, thoughtful places in terms of the collections, but also the, not just private, but museum. And then, what I feel really strongly about is just also making sure my place in the community feels right, and, creating partnerships. And so all that's a little bit of the snapshot of me. And I think it just helps to give context for, what I'll talk about here, which is I've always thought, because people will often say, well, do you make work anymore? Do you paint anymore? And I'll say no, and then it's like someone died, and I'm like, it's okay, it's okay. I didn't have to grieve the end of my practice, but I still, it's this creative outlet that I have. I also think it's really, hopefully, valuable to my artists that I have made things, and not just because I know how to make a stretcher and what it's like to use oil paint or whatever, but what it's like emotionally in a studio practice, and how it can be isolating, and what it's like to just, it's hard. It can be hard. There are challenges that come with all of this. So, but, I think that this is a good time to say, I also, when it does feel challenging and when it can feel kind of hard in what you're doing, we should all remind ourselves that, we can't do anything without artists, meaning my gallery, I couldn't do anything without the artists. Curators can't put together shows without the artists. Collectors wouldn't have anything to collect. It is, what you all do is really important and vital to the ecosystem that is what we're doing. And to this, specifically to Dallas, of course, to kind of the fabric of, the culture here. So just, remember that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about just doing the work. I think that is putting in the time. And, I remember very early on after I'd graduated from undergrad, and, I'm like, where am I going to get my studio space, And I remember talking to this one woman, and she was like, you need to just, maybe you find a studio space, but set yourself up on your dining room table, figure it out, make it happen. Don't get caught up in the romance of what could be this, studio space. Make it happen, whatever that means and is possible for you. Because maybe it is for 2 years that you're working on a table like this, and you're works on paper or whatever. And like my dad told me once, measure the back of your car, because you should not make anything bigger than the back width of your car. It was very good advice. I don't think you should do that forever, but at a certain time, I think it's important to kind of just be pragmatic, know your parameters, but make the work, do the work. And I think part of that is, looking at your peers, and that means also, looking at work. I often say, whenever I see an artist who is informed, I feel like I know that there's something there. They've They know where they are in kind of the context of art history, what their peers are doing, what artists that they are just interested in terms of, the ones showing at Zwerner and Gagosian and wherever else, but like, look at work, go out and look at work. We have these amazing institutions, galleries, and all of these things. I think it's just really important to get out, because sometimes I know that can be hard because you might feel, like you don't want to do that, but I think it's important. I think it's all, subjective. I mean, I want to say make good work, but I know that's, up to whoever it may be. However, I think one of the most important things, and I was talking with my husband about this morning, is finding someone who will be honest with you. Multiple people if you can. This is why I was talking about Marion Marshall earlier. Because, even now in my having the gallery 11 years and, doing these things, I'm still trying to shake things up at times, try new ideas, and just look inward, right? And, I need people to be honest with me. So my husband is really honest with me. Marion is honest with me. That might be it, but that's good, right? Like, and then my husband said, yeah, he used to tell his film students, you can't always listen to your mother or your latte sipping wanker friend. I was like, okay, yes. He's in the film industry, so it's like a different thing. But anyway, it's nice to have your mom like your stuff, of course, but like find a way to get honest feedback. I think that kind of like rolls into community, which is like a place like this is amazing that you can have studio space among other people. I do think that's unique. The Trinity Groves area too, where my first gallery was, and like geographic concentration of artists is really special. And I mostly just know that from graduate school. I mean, we were together, what that leads to is, you hope, critical feedback. And I just think that's really what we all need for our work to progress, And it doesn't just have to be artists, it can be, especially in graduate school, and I don't know if CU is doing this or not, but bringing in critics. We had a curator, writer, critic that would come and visit us in graduate school every 3 weeks. And he was incredibly honest, and it was hard at times, our director. But I think finding that feedback among the other artists, but I think finding a way to invite people into your studio, former professors, because I do think that's how the work can progress. I think another thing with community and relying on your artist peers is, assuming people are sort of willing to share information and things, but opportunities, residency opportunities, grants. I know that from my perspective as a gallerist, I will turn to my artists and ask them who they're looking at, who they think is interesting, because they're not looking at it through a commercial lens. They're looking at it through more of an honest, I think this is cool lens, I think this is interesting. And that's why I think it's so important, for artists to have the people and artists and community around them. And then also the just, pragmatic things like, we have this with the Contemporary Art Dealers Association, is like asking, what vendor are you using for this? What materials? All these things that, I know artists are we're all experimenting all the time, and I think relying on each other for that is also underrated. I think it's really valuable. Sharing skills, sharing materials, things like that. Post-grad, like if you've, and this doesn't apply to everyone because I know, when we're at different times in our lives and things, but I did graduate school, and it's the thing that really, changed my life. And although I went in it with a really naive, perspective. Another thing my dad said to me, I'll tell my dad, he got a lot of shout outs, but he was like, you have to pay that loan back, right? And it was like, yeah, sure, I do. Well, I finally paid it off, but it was like 20 years later. So if I knew then what I know now, I probably wouldn't have done it that way. Now I encourage people to look at programs that are free or you get paid to do them or whatever, because it's really hard. I had debt for a really long time. However, I truly think the time there and the relationships I have from there are exactly why things are happening right now, from this grad school experience I had 20 plus years ago. But I think the other thing that I did right after school, I did a residency program that was a live work, and it was in Baltimore called the Creative Alliance, and it was amazing. And it was like the perfect thing for me to do. It was kind of an extension of grad school. It felt like I had community. I had a studio, I had a living space, there was a gallery there, so we were able to kind of do these collaborative things. But I think if you have the ability to do residencies, and they don't have to be, mine was live work, so it was like 3 years. I could do a year and then keep extending it up to 3 years. But of course, there's other residencies for people who have families and things like that. I know, you can't up and leave or take your family with you or whatever. But what you might be able to do is a week or a 2 week or whatever, where I think residencies can be so good for, even if you don't make a lick of work, it's that, because I know that the thinking about the work is just as important as making the work at times. I think I kind of talked about this already about studio space. I think just making that happen, whatever that means, the small room in your house to finding one of these places where you do have some community, I think it's important, is just make it happen. And then, I kind of talked a little bit about, creating my business plan when I opened the gallery. It's something I now talk with my artists about, which is, thinking of yourself as a business. That's what you are. And, I don't know if, I feel like I can't speak fully to all of this, but, getting an LLC, of course we have an LLC. So it's like, I've told my artists, create an LLC. It's like these kind of, what can be pretty simple things to do, because you can really do all of that online, like through LegalZoom. And you pay a fee, and it's, then you have a business entity. And then getting a checking account that's not going to charge you any fees, and, starting to, when you sell work, putting the money into there and tracking your expenses, because you'll be able to, with taxes and everything, claim all of those expenses towards what you're doing. So, all of you may know those sorts of things, but I think it's important to just think about it, revisit it if you haven't, because that's what we are, is we're all small businesses. And then, relationships. I feel like relationships are kind of at the core of everything, but like I said, my relationships from graduate school have, come, things have happened from those relationships, relying on those between your peers, but also, part of this is being present. And, I talk about, sometimes you don't feel like going to openings, but, going to openings, coming to things like this, being present, showing your face, introducing yourself, maybe don't pull up the images on your phone just yet, but being present, because I know, and that's kind of like, go and support your artist friends, going back to the relationships with your artist friend, peer community, because things happen from those sorts of things, because you were present at something else. And but I think this also has to do with curators and finding a way to, first of all, I think following what your regional curators are doing, following them on Instagram, looking at whatever shows they're putting together. I not only tell artists this, I tell collectors this too, because it's interesting, because again, sometimes it gets commercial, but I would say that generally they're doing a lot of research and, kind of editing and learning about what's going on in certain genres or, focus, between the curator of craft at the DMA to, the young curators at the Modern right now. I mean, I just think it's a good way to start to learn kind of at least what our region is doing, which I think is, that starts to feel attainable. And meeting them if you can, because it could be that you're able to have some way in and be able to invite them to your studio or to one of your shows if you end up having a show at a gallery. I think that's the curatorial relationships I really value a lot, and really I've built them over a long period of time, and they've been important to the gallery, but to my artists as well. And that also has to do with, juried shows. I think there's kind of always a question of should I or shouldn't I? And I think juried shows can be a really great opportunity. I think the big thing is looking at who the juror is, not just the place, but looking at who the juror is, because whether or not you receive the inclusion in the show or the award or whatever it may be, is that they've seen your work, right? They've seen the images. And I think that can be, it's like we had the Cluley Project's open call. I think it was the last one. And we were like, wow, there's a lot of ceramics in this open call. And so that really was what led us to do a ceramics exhibition a few months later. And we pulled from that. We didn't, those artists weren't necessarily given the Cluley Project's recipient award, but they were included in a show at Erin Cluley Gallery, which was really, I think, exciting and an opportunity that they may not, I can probably say they wouldn't have had otherwise, but they applied for the open call, so that was good. I think related to that too is having good images of your work. I mean, I think that's really super critical. And I know now it's probably a little bit easier just because technology is better, and even phones and cameras and all these things are better, and we have more, access to these things. So I've babbled on a lot. I feel like now I should just have y'all ask me questions. It is all right, yes. I mean, and I think that certainly my approach in the gallery, and I tell my team this as well, is one, I say it's free for us to be nice. Like, just be nice. That's a very simple and easy thing to do, and that's to everyone that walks in the door. And I think that absolutely you should introduce yourself, and I think that I think generally there's the stereotype of that New York dealer who isn't going to give you the time of day, which probably really exists up there especially. But I think a lot of the gallerists and people who work with the galleries here in Dallas are warm and welcoming. And I think that you do need to be mindful of people's time in terms of not asking them to look at work on the spot or something like that, that goes in the gallery. It also goes in the art fairs. At the art fair, if you've been to the Dallas Art Fair, it often feels like a time that might be a good idea, but it's really not, I will say. And I hope that doesn't sound, rude or anything, but there's a lot on the line. It's very stressful. We've all been working a lot, and so that's not the time. But yes, introduce yourself, because that's where you start. That's then when I know who you are and what your name is, and my team too. They're the ones that boots on the ground more, like really going out and looking and stuff. So you probably want to introduce yourself to them. So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's hard finding the balance, I know. I mean, I would say that it's just like, work-life balance that I talk about a lot with, to myself and then to my team, but it's like just making sure you're carving out the time for yourself, and gosh, I don't know if I have like a really like sound advice for that, but I mean, it's great what you're doing for the other artists, but just making sure you're finding the time for your own practice, so I know that's probably not like, it's simple, but finding the balance. Oh, yeah. And that's in my notes, and I didn't cover it. So, this is one of the things I feel really strongly about. Thank you. I must have just scrolled right past that. So, I have had, and I've talked about this before with groups. Like, I have had studio visits where we go to the studio visit and there's not really work. Maybe they have a painting up or one going or something. And maybe that's because they have all of their work at another show. But I think it's so important to make sure that you have work in the studio. And I know that sometimes it's gonna, it could feel like, but the opportunity is here. Like, I have to take it. But I really think that even if it means delaying it a little bit, it's really important to have work that you feel good about and that feels cohesive. I think that's another part of all of this. I mean, we learned that even just in undergrad. It was like, what was your thesis going to be? It was like a cohesive body of work, thinking about that for the studio visit as well. And I think, another thing that I really like when artists do is having work up that's physical. So it's the latest things that you've done. But I love to have a chronological set of images that maybe are on screen. And that doesn't mean you have to have 50 images or something, but let's just say there's, 15 images of works that are previous to the ones I'm looking at that shows me a progression. I think that I'm just a big fan of knowing, well, because even when the works are in the studio, I'll say which one came first, because I'm so interested in seeing kind of how things are progressing. So I think that, we're all pretty much set up with some sort of device that we can share with someone that's in the studio. And I love that personally. And I think it makes for a more fruitful, productive visit. I had gone through graduate school, I was making work, I was in the residency program, and then I started working for the gallery, And so I'm dealing with all the other artists' work, not my own. And I loved it. And I loved like the business side of it. And I think that I then was like, I think I want to kind of move from dealing the work and working the business side of it and maybe put my practice aside. I also felt at the time, which I don't think I really needed to, but I felt like there was some conflict of interest, And I don't necessarily think that's the case. I was just paranoid about it for some reason. But, and then I go and I work for the gallery, I work for a museum, and then I make the transition back to working for a gallery that's my own and it's commercial. But it's not my work, of course. But I think that, what I hope in terms of the gallery artist relationship is that it really is a partnership, What I hope is that me and my team can handle the things, the promotion of the shows, the inventory system, introducing the work to clients, to museum professionals, all of those things in order for the artist to be able to make the work and to have the time for that. Now, we work with about 20 artists right now that we represent, and they're all different in terms of like what they are comfortable doing. Like Zeke he loves to promote his work. He is, talk about a present artist. He is the example. And he's one of probably a handful of the artists that I work with who really think commercially about his work too. And because I don't think it's necessarily bad or good. I think it's healthy and smart to know that what you're doing is your business. You want to provide for yourself, your family, and all of these things. But he really does probably more than anyone else. Like he's kind of hustling in a different way than any of my other artists. But yeah. So, early on in the gallery, like I went and looked at a lot, like physically went out and looked at shows. And then life just kind of changed a little bit. I still go and look at a lot, but I just don't have the time to look at as much. But, this is kind of going back to this like relationship stuff. The work is really what is important. But I did say after I left Dallas Contemporary, and it was my name on the door, that what was also really important to me was that these people were good people, just like I can choose to work with people who are good people. So, and sometimes that's because, like I said, like one of my artists has maybe made the introduction, or a friend, a trusted kind of like friend in the industry has said, you should like keep this artist on your radar, and so start looking and learning. I would say that what the social media does for that process is just that if there's activity, I can see it, but I wouldn't say that I'm basing any decisions on that. I think it's also, between every gallery. I think obviously we all have different programs, and I think my personal history and experience with studying painting, even the photographers I show have practices that are rooted in painting. Like it's a very painterly program, I would say, generally. But I think that what is also important, and I have turned this question onto artists who have approached me too, in a nice way, I promise, but saying, do you think that your work fits in the galleries program? Because I think that's really important, is to, of course, that's what you want, is for your work to fit, because if it fits, and I know that's also kind of subjective, but if it fits, you hope that's going to make something that's successful and just meaningful, So. I think the other part of this is like, do you have something that's going to help, like, underwrite what you're doing too, and that's often another job, and just being practical about that.
Say that again loud.
Having the figuring out your finances so that you can actually do the work, and so I know that often means having a job, whether, whatever that may be. And some of us are fortunate that, that maybe you have a partner that's able to help you sort of, but I think, I think that just leads into, focusing on making good work. I know that just is it, but it is what it is, and what goes along with that, all of the feedback that makes your work progress. I think if you can do residencies, I look back and wished that I could have done I did the long residency, but that really was more like a living situation extension of grad school. Like, I would have loved to have gone and done some of these month-long residencies where you meet people, your practice can really evolve in those places. So, if you have the ability to do that. And then, I know that there are so many incredible artists and not enough galleries, and so I know that is just a simple truth. But that's where these kind of, juried, use discretion, I think, but, looking at these juried exhibitions and who's the jury and where is it, and, how that could benefit from you, so. I'll kind of give maybe two different sort of like examples, and I would say, with Cluley projects, which we've the brick and mortar, we've closed that chapter of it, but we're still doing the programming at the gallery. And, because the reason that kind of came about was like somebody was talking about Major League and minor league baseball and farm teams and, like this kind of, but it was an interesting, analogy. It was like this kind of having a gallery that's set up to support something like this, where it's giving more opportunity to artists who, and what we really hope for is not only giving them a show and this exposure, but also hopefully showing them what a good, fruitful relationship is like working with a gallery, because we've also, over the years, like talked with artists who have had terrible experiences with galleries for one reason or another. And so, and that's everything from, telling them that we need good images from you for your work, and we're going to give you great images of the installation of the show, and and then kind of what we're going to shoulder and what you're going to shoulder. So in terms of Cluley projects, and so we were giving solo shows to artists, and and then consigning their work for a time after that. And then some of the artists we have ended up, like Du Chow is an artist who we now work with, ongoing. And, it was kind of a mix of, the response to his work was just incredible. And the partnership was really good, and he was, the work was evolving in a really nice way. And it's not real sort of like hard and fast, exactly what. But then the other side of that is Lovey Olivia, who has a show up in the gallery right now, along with Zeke. We were, I remembered finally, I don't know if you and I talked about this, but I could, the night of the opening, I was like, what is my story with Lovey? How did we meet? Vicki Meek was doing a talk, and so I went down for that. And after the talk, Vicki said, you should meet this artist. And so Lovey and I talked a little bit. And then I go back, and Krista, my employee, Krista Chalkley, who was working with me at the time, they said, I told them about Lovey. And they were like, I've been following Lovey's work. I was like, whoa, okay. So, this kind of stars aligning. And so I said, which I often do in the main gallery programming, is introduce their work through group exhibitions to start. That's usually, and it's kind of like a trial period, if you want to call it that, but it's nice to we put Lovey's work in the context of, I think it was Nick Nicosia, Renee Trevino, Lovey, and maybe one other artist. It was a really beautiful show. And then we've shown Lovey's work at the art fair once, and so we've kind of had this I think that's been 3 years. And then now she has a solo exhibition, and we're working with her ongoing. So it kind of, it sort of varies. And then maybe I'll give one other example of just looking at the work, you know what I mean? And just continuing to follow. I'm very careful with my doing studio visits because, to be honest, I just want to make sure that I'm not, getting hopes up for whatever, I want to make sure I'm being very intentional about my time and what I'm, going to visit an artist studio. I used to do it more. I would say I do it less now. It's very intentional when I do it. I would say any of those things. I wouldn't mind if you had a folder of images and you popped them up in your whatever your preview app is on your computer. I think some people use Instagram as kind of an archive, which is also nice. And I will say, as we all, I think we all know, a lot of people look at that. So I think there's that. And then, there's a couple of my artists who really use their website as their archive. And so there's that can also be a nice reference, way to pull it up as well. But I would say any of those things. I think it's just having that, this was 5 years ago when I started thinking about this body of work, and this was some of the works that have come since, and then, here we are now. So, it shows me the cohesiveness about it, the evolution of the work. I think that's important. I've visited many a spare room in a house. Yes. Yeah. Honestly, if I've definitely been to house studios, and I just think I think a lot of people in this region that's the way people work. I think that's perfectly fine to have people over when you're ready to that kind of studio setting. Yeah. So when I was in graduate school at MICA, Amy Sherald was in my cohort. So this was 14 of us, and if you don't know Amy Sherald's work, she's the artist that painted the Michelle Obama portrait and just closed her show at the Whitney at American Sublime. So she and I are, old friends, colleagues, and, we've followed each other's work over the years and kept in touch and various other things. And so about 6 months ago, I get an email from Frieze London, which I had not applied for that fair. That's an art fair in London, very prestigious. One of the, I think people know Frieze, people know Art Basel. And so I get this email and it says, you've been invited to participate, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes you get the emails that say, you're invited to apply. Great. But this was, I had to read it 10 times, and I was like, this is crazy. And so what it was an invitation to participate in the fair through a special initiative that they have called Artist to Artist, where known, famous artists, Amy Sherald, nominate and select an artist whose, things are happening in their career, but there would be considered kind of a new voice. And so she nominated Renee Trevino, who was also in graduate school with us at the time. So this is all we were all in grad school at the same time, back in 2003 or 5 or whatever it was. And so Amy nominated Renee and the gallery to participate in this section. And it's this section of, there's only 6 galleries. The fair itself, there's 200 galleries, but we're in this really special section where they're, Tiffany is a sponsor, and they're really gonna try to help promote Renee and the gallery, and all this is happening in a couple of weeks. But I was just like, what is happening? This is crazy. And so I text Renee and I'm like, did you know about this? And he said, well, she told me to send her some images, but you never know what happens with these things. And so I then texted her and I was like, what? Thank you. She was like, I love you. I love Renee. I was so happy. And so it's just this kind of talk about a relationship thing that, I would never have been able to predict, but we will be on a stage that I know is bigger than we've ever had before, certainly. And so we really, we're hopeful that, what we really think will happen is sales, of course, we hope, because it's very expensive to participate in all of this stuff, but museum and curatorial interest for Renee. He's just kind of at this point in his career, and what she ended up telling me whenever I saw her and visited with her in May, she was like, I couldn't believe that something hasn't already happened with him in his career. And so she was really excited to kind of be the one to help, propel this. So it's very exciting. I'm very proud. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Yay.
Thank you, Erin.
Yes.
So much.
Thank you.